Sparlock is back in stores, more about him at the end of the video. This is a children's video made for Jehovah's Witnesses, more concretely for Jehovah's Witness children. It's a silent video, meaning it's available for kids in every single language because no dubbing is needed. And the message is simple. Your money is better spent as a donation to the religion than on ice cream. But this is obviously not how the religion started, because unlike anything that the Jehovah's Witness religion may tell you, the religion is definitely for profit. And it has been for profit since its inception. When Charles Russell started his evangelizing work, he had no idea he was starting a religion. What he cared about was for people to listen to his ideas. So he did what you did back then and started writing literature. He started publishing books and magazines and developing groups of people to study and promote those books and magazines. Those book clubs or book studies would gather to study the latest book that Russell had come up with. So Russell had a pretty good incentive to keep coming up with books to sell to his followers. And his followers would then promote those books and magazines to other people, indoctrinating them into getting literature so they would convert. None of that was for free, of course. Books and magazines were a commodity back then because I'm told YouTube didn't exist yet, so reading was the main source of entertainment and information for most people. As I recap in my Why Jehovah's Witnesses Preach video, this led to the creation of colporteurs, people who believed in the words of Russell and who worked as independent book salespeople. Unlike what the religion would have you believe, colporteurs weren't preachers. In fact, after Russell died and Rutherford took over, colporteurs were reminded that their job wasn't to preach, it was to sell books. If they wanted to preach, they could rent their own kingdom hall. That's because the religion was made around selling publications. That's how the religion made its money. For 100 years, they made a religion around selling books to strangers door to door, and even integrating practicing sales pitches during the midweek meetings as soon as they became a religion, so they could practice selling to other people. Since this is how they made money, this is one of the very few things that women were allowed and even invited to do. Remember, there was no teaching door to door back then, so women could totally go out to sell publications as colporteurs or, later on, pioneers, while following the misogynist rules from the Bible that forbid them to teach. And this worked out flawlessly generation after generation, finding people door to door to sell literature to, so they could be indoctrinated into finding people door to sell literature to. It was a self-perpetuating cycle that grew the religion quite well, from its humble origins as a small publishing house to a large organization with millions of followers publishing books in all languages around the world. By the end of the 80s, the religion was publishing 2 magazines titles twice a month, selling them for 25 cents each. They had subscribers who would get their magazines delivered by the Jehovah's Witnesses when they went door to door, and sold more expensive, colorful books to both strangers and followers, who would be expected to buy their magazines and books to study during the meetings, just like the religion had been doing since its inception. But then, in 1990, something terrible happened. Things were changing in the United States, and at the beginning of 1990, the US Supreme Court decided to uphold state sales taxes on religious items and books, which would mean the Jehovah's Witnesses would have to start paying taxes for every single thing they sold. The leadership realized that it was over. Paying taxes would complicate things too much and they would lose a ton of money. Plus, the religion had a strong following now, and the end of the 20th century was upon them. I assume that's what they were thinking when they decided to respond by basically saying how they would no longer ask for a specific amount of money when distributing literature door to door. I imagine the leadership was congratulating themselves behind closed doors. They would still receive close to a similar amount of money from the books and magazines they sold, and they would avoid paying taxes because they would be asking for donations, and donations are not taxable. There's no way this could go wrong. Except, of course, it went terribly wrong. Between them no longer getting money from literature and the death of print and media, their fate was sealed. I have no more than empirical and circumstantial evidence to deduct this, but it's in the 90s when their growth plateaued, and I don't think that's a coincidence. At first, Jehovah's Witnesses were enthusiastically giving books away and asking for donations, which they were encouraged to place in separate pouches to keep until the next meeting when they could empty the coins into the donation box. But soon, they realized that asking for donations wasn't working out, because of course it wasn't. Not only were they receiving less money, but they were converting fewer people. Think about it. If you were the kind of person who buys magazines to read, which ones would you read first? The ones you paid for, or the ones you got for free or close to? I remember very early in my childhood hearing adults saying how people just didn't appreciate publications enough once they were free, and they would be annoyed when in their return visits to try and sell them their next magazine for a donation, the housekeeper hadn't even bothered reading the first publication they had placed. And you see that in the religion too. The entire department in charge of making hardcover books was phased out once they realized they couldn't make their books more expensive with free labor. Since the religion quickly realized that most people simply took the literature and placed donations in the box whenever. This led to funky-looking literature being released to the Jehovah's Witnesses when leftover materials from books they were no longer going to make were used to make the last batches of sing books and other books that were more common. I would have loved to be a fly on the wall in the governing body's Wednesday meetings when they realized that they actually knew nothing about business when a single decision brought down one of the largest Christian publishing companies in the world. But then they realized they don't make money out of printing books. They make their money out of the free labor they can exploit to make assets. And that's how the religion started shifting from a publishing company into a construction company. When I was a little kid being indoctrinated at kingdom halls in Mexico, the religion was expecting persecution from the Mexican government, so the halls were usually somewhat out of sight and looked like plain buildings. The first kingdom hall I remember was walled off, so you couldn't really see into the area unless the gates were open. And the second kingdom hall I went to was built behind a house. These halls were often co-owned by the elders, and we were told that they were built like that because Armageddon was coming and our place of worship wasn't as important as our spiritual food, the publications. But then by the end of the 90s, construction began on what the religion called approved kingdom halls in our city. Finally, we were going to have one of those nice kingdom halls that we saw in dramas with lots of space everywhere instead of a claustrophobic, often windowless room. Every Jehovah's Witness in the city helped build it, and everyone was so excited about finally having a dedicated kingdom hall because, of course, you can only dedicate to God buildings that the religion has direct control over. And it didn't stop there. Soon, there were talks of building kingdom halls all over the city, and even about a large project for an assembly hall, which we were all invited to go and build. I remember at least 3 times in 2 years being taken into the assembly hall in construction to hear a talk about the importance of generosity to support this project. I vividly remember a talk from an invited Bethelite who was supervising the construction project, reading how Israelites collected their gold to make a false statue, but now we would collect our gold to praise Jehovah. Then he showed us his ring finger to show he had donated his wedding ring to the cause, and urged people who didn't have money to donate their rings too. I wish I had jewelry to donate, and I emptied my pockets in the donation box to show how I wanted to support Jehovah. Because what Jehovah's Witnesses seem to forget very quickly is that the religion doesn't pay for the development of the halls. The followers do. Witnesses both pay for the hall and build the hall with their own hands. And once they're dedicated to Jehovah, the ownership shifts to the religion for it to add it to its portfolio of other real estate projects to play and shift around with. The importance between Jehovah's Witness literature and kingdom halls started to switch. Whereas before, the most important thing ever was the spiritual food and kingdom halls were just where you talked about it, now kingdom halls started to become the most important place to be, and the quality of the information no longer mattered as much. Now it was all about building, dedicating, and maybe selling, but only to build and dedicate better kingdom halls. The religion got a renewed grip on all of the multiple properties around the world that they controlled, and consolidated power over them by ensuring all buildings were directly under the legal control of the religion to take advantage of the real estate market. And once they took over kingdom halls, they started shifting people around to free up real estate to sell and gaslight their followers into moving out of the kingdom halls they themselves had paid for.
They have us going to the South congregation and everybody else from our group is going to North.
Yeah, I saw that. My aunt and cousins will be going there too.
Well, that doesn't make any sense. They should keep you together. I saw your name on the list for the South congregation, but your grandkids and their families, they're going to North. So what are you gonna do?
What do you mean?
Well, are you going to north or are you going to south?
Now, sweetie, didn't you say you saw my name listed under the South congregation?
Yeah, but
So, I'll be going to the South congregation.
Whereas before, congregations were somewhat independent in how they managed their kingdom halls, now congregations were being broken apart and dispersed, dissolving the congregations that built, paid for, and maintained the kingdom hall for years, releasing valuable real estate and giving the religion the massive boost of money they needed.
One of the broadcasts a little while ago, Brother Lucioni mentioned that we needed about 1,200 new kingdom halls. Well, after a master plan was established, it was found out we don't need that many new kingdom halls. What we need to do is better utilize the kingdom halls that we have. And so it's estimated that we may need 200 or less kingdom halls because of this beautiful master plan, non-construction solutions. We had over 100 or about 195 overcrowded auditoriums with more than 4 congregations. But after merging and relocating congregations, better utilizing congregations, with the 30 studies that are represented in this report, we're down to now only 32 overcrowded auditoriums. So you see the benefit of initiating this master plan. And that represents over $100 million in savings.
This is from a leaked internal clip, showing how the process worked in the background, grabbing kingdom halls, dissolving congregations, and freeing up millions of dollars in real estate in a matter of months. Nowadays, Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that they need to keep building kingdom halls and other buildings for the expansion of the work, with the leadership building more and more remote translation offices and other office spaces that they can immediately sell right after they're done using it. All you need to do is to convince their followers that the religion needs them to build more stuff, despite the fact that they haven't even seen any significant growth for over a decade now. It's hard to measure how effective this approach has been, but I assume it can't be as good as selling publications because, after all, you do need a constant supply of free workers to keep building a constant supply of kingdom halls. And I don't think they can make and sell as many buildings to compensate for the huge loss of no longer being able to monetize the world's most printed magazine. And they still had to come up with spiritual food. Since they couldn't make money with printed publications, but the followers had already been primed to expect them, they became a liability instead of an asset. They couldn't make money out of spiritual food anymore, so after a lot of growing pains, they realized that they could be the last ones to jump into the internet train and distribute spiritual food there. But here's where the disconnect of Jehovah's Witnesses comes into play. When they stopped selling publications, they didn't say to their followers that it was because they wanted to avoid paying taxes. They told everyone that they were doing this because the end was near and God would provide, and what was important was to get the information out there as much as possible. They had gaslit their followers into believing that the work was beyond the money so well that they believed it themselves. Now, content is king, and regular content behind a paywall or with ads is how publishing companies work nowadays. If Russell was alive today, he'd be making content against religion on YouTube, or, let's be honest, on Rumble, and would make the religion about his subscriber count and about the mugs he sells or something. But Jehovah's Witnesses have strayed so far from their original business model, they could no longer outright sell things. They had to streamline their operation, reduce the number of books and magazines that were being printed, and spend a ton of money hosting videos to replace their free publications instead of getting paid by monetizing their content as they did for well over 100 years. Conventions and assemblies, before big moneymakers thanks to the sale of books and food, were now a financial burden that they kept up because it's what they had been doing all this time. They weren't selling anything anymore. They had always prided themselves on not asking money at events or meetings, and they had to make them look so important that they couldn't just remove them altogether when they stopped becoming profitable. And we're not even going to get into the millions they have had to pay in settlement for cases of child abuse and whatnot. Suffice to say, the Jehovah's Witness religion needs money, and it needs money now. If they couldn't get money from strangers in exchange for propaganda, and they can't make enough money from real estate, they could always turn back to their followers. Now, this wouldn't be ideal. Their followers are the most uneducated Christians out there, as we've explored before, but it could work. After all, They no longer had to spend time and resources writing articles about science and nature to try to appeal to a wider market because they couldn't make money on the wider market. And this takes us back to the ice cream money from the beginning, because GW.org makes the most amount of money from donations, including the donations from children themselves, who are taught to deprive themselves of comfort to give that money to the religion. They start the manipulation process, of course, by saying they're not asking for donations.
As you know, for over 130 years, this organization has never solicited for funds, and it is certainly not going to start now.
They know that their followers have very little money, and they know that they would call them out for going back on their word for not asking for donations. So they pretend that's not what they're doing when that's exactly what they're doing.
Money? Now, the fact is we never beg for money, but that's not to say we can't talk about money in Jehovah's organization, the earthly part. So it is long-standing there is a balance here. You know, going back to the Watchtower, I said a very long time ago, we have never considered it proper to solicit money for the Lord's cause after the common custom, referring to Christendom. It is our judgment that money raised by the various begging devices in the name of our Lord is offensive, unacceptable to him. It does not bring his blessing either upon the givers of the work accomplished or the work accomplished. So we do not need to be coerced into giving. We gladly use our money to support kingdom activities. So that stands to this day, but we'd never want to come to the conclusion you can't talk about money.
They're only letting you know that they don't have enough money, and your heart can compel you to do whatever you want. This is a slimy way of manipulating people because it implies that if your heart doesn't compel you to give money, then there's something wrong with you. They don't just come out and say, hey, can you give us money? Because then they may either get a yes or a no. If they frame it like this, they either get good people who donate or bad people who don't donate. Because you see, if you stop donating, it'll stop the life-saving work that they do.
The service committee, under the direction of the governing body, is expanding and accelerating the life-saving preaching work right up to the end.
See, they want you to feel like they're too focused saving lives to do what you do and get a job. Their work is way too important for that. This is a double-edged argument since it implies that they're doing more important work than you are, so the least you can do is to support them financially. But it also protects them from criticism, because if they're doing life-saving work, then of course they can ask for money. How dare you even suggest saying something negative about them? Why are you throwing mud at the religion when you aren't doing anything for the world yourself?
All our contributions have a meaningful share in supporting kingdom interests worldwide. Each donation is like a gift in hand to our Heavenly Father, Jehovah. When we give from our heart, we are expressing our love for Him, and that is the best gift we can give Him.
This toxic positivity inundates the mind of their followers, silencing any criticism, regardless of how valid that is. Because them being criticized is perceived as equal to hate speech and somehow an obstacle to their work. Some of the best, most trustworthy charities and activists will be happy to show you how much they receive and how it's spent, because they understand that, although not needed, transparency goes a long way if you're asking someone for their hard-earned money. The Jehovah's Witnesses go the other way and pretend that even making questions is hatred. Think about it. There's no respectful way of, say, asking Jeffrey Jackson about the sexual abusers currently hiding in their database. If a reporter asked him and pressed him on it, he will later retell that story as the story of how he defended himself against a hateful reporter from Satan's system of things. After all, don't you see they're doing so much good work? Don't you see all the things that they're doing?
There is no other organization that compares to Jehovah's organization. Everything the organization provides and helps with is free of charge. But Jehovah invites all of us to give to him or contribute our material resources according to what we personally decide.
The Jehovah's Witness leadership has this almost masturbatory sense of achievement, where everything they do is blown out to be a huge accomplishment that could only be accomplished if Jehovah was blessing them. And you wouldn't want to avoid supporting an organization that Jehovah is blessing, right?
There was a lot of obstacles to overcome, and those were overcome little by little, but we started to see Jehovah's hand as seemingly impossible obstacles began to be removed.
Psalm 127 and verse 1 says, "Unless Jehovah builds the house, it is in vain that the builders work hard on it." Seeing Jehovah's direction firsthand through the various phases convinces us that the success of this project is not dependent on favourable circumstances, the skill of the workers, or even the hard work of those involved. Building this new branch is only possible because of Jehovah's blessing.
Everything they do is shown as the best thing ever. They don't just find some buildings, use free labor to renovate them, and sell them at a profit. They're building for Jehovah. Everything they do has to be incredible, with them filming badly produced documentaries to show themselves as the experts from a proper documentary and give themselves importance. They love pretending to be more than a dwindling high control group and pretend their religion is unique and not one of many obscure Christian sects that the vast majority of people don't take seriously. And they do this not only by overly exaggerating their accomplishments, making it look like the very ordinary and boring work they do with your donations is actually impressive and awe-inspiring. They also remind you that they did all of that despite the biggest baddie of them all, the devil himself.
The authorities in Norway have threatened to remove our legal registration because of our scriptural beliefs and practices regarding disfellowshipping. In the future, various governments will challenge our freedom of worship. They may pressure us to change our scriptural beliefs, but we're certainly not going to do that.
For the Jehovah's Witness leadership, the devil is present pretty much every time that things don't go their way. He manipulates the world around them so well that you just have to donate to support their fight. Anything that's bad for them is, for some reason, good for Satan. The devil rejoices to see Jehovah's Witnesses separated over asking questions instead of united to fight against them. Satan, however, is just a placeholder culprit to cover their own incompetence at best or their own crimes at worst. For example, apostates like me regularly call out Watchtower for their abusive child abuse policies, where the system is made to protect the brand instead of the children. The Jehovah's Witness religion minimizes the issue to pretend it's only down to some bad people doing bad things and blame Satan for saying otherwise.
Another way we can contribute to the oneness, rejecting false stories that are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization. We reject outright such lies.
This has a dual effect. First, it makes them feel important. They are alone fighting against Satan himself, this vague force that you cannot listen to that's extremely powerful. And it literally demonizes anyone with valid criticism for the religion, immediately silencing anyone who even begins to suggest a connection between their need for money and their need to pay child abuse settlements in court. All they want you to know is that they have some vague legal issues and that Satan is behind them and that you are in a unique place to help them with your donations. They don't want anyone to look into why they're having legal issues, because then you'd realize that the issues don't come from Satan, come from their victims who are finally speaking out. This toxic positivity inundates the whole religion and is especially apparent when they pretend they're not asking for donations because they instead highlight how your donations can only be used for something positive.
Can I give this to our brothers affected by the hurricane?
Of course you can. We'll put it in the contribution box on Sunday.
My piggy bank was empty. I guess I can't help.
There are many things you can do to help. First, you can save some money for next time. Jesus felt the same way when he was here on earth. Do you remember what he said when he helped the leper?
I want to!
Yes, he did what he could to help others. just like you. That makes us very proud of you.
Once you get followers to believe these BS, they will self-police. There's no rule that says you can't question where donations go. In fact, they even pay lip service to transparency when they give witnesses a recap of how their donations were used in the congregation. Witnesses know, however, not to ask for more than that, and to instead assume that the money is going to a good cause, almost as a proof of their faith. Trusting that the governing body will do the right thing is the righteous thing to do.
The governing body could be likened to the voice of Jesus, the head of the congregation. So when we willingly submit to the faithful slave, we're ultimately submitting to Jesus' authority and direction.
This environment makes it so anybody who even thinks negatively about them asking for donations to be immediately labeled as an opposer. You can't say anything that's not glowingly positive. Even if you see something, you should shut up, because questioning them equals being against them.
If the conversation turns negative, get out. Satan is behind the twisted teachings of apostates. He's the father of the lie. And those who lie are doing exactly what their father does. The apostates have nothing to offer us, brothers. All they have to offer is hate. All they have to offer is criticism and negative talk.
They will use any and every trick in the book to keep their followers from asking a very simple question. Should I support this organization? Instead, they gaslight and manipulate people, so even formulating that question itself is tantamount to an insult, a betrayal of who you are and what you're supposed to represent.
If they are the words of apostates, why would we believe them?
This obviously isn't how trustworthy corporations or people work. Honest people don't need to silence questions because there are no questions that can break them. That's the benefit of being truthful. You don't need to heavily and unapologetically remove anyone who asks questions if you're not afraid of people wondering what the answer may be. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the Jehovah's Witnesses or any other religion or charity shouldn't ask for money. Obviously, that's not the argument I'm making. Thousands of nonprofits ask for money and show people how it's used as an incentive for people to give them more money. GW.org doesn't need to manipulate people to ask for money. They can simply say, hey, we're all human, we all need money, here's a general breakdown of how your donations are used so you can help us out. But they can't do that because they're a shady organization. They don't believe they owe anyone any explanation for how they use the money that their followers give them. That money is the salary paid to them by God Himself, and only He can judge what they do with it as His faithful and discreet servant. They have to manipulate people into donating with lies and exaggerations because they fear people wouldn't donate if they showed the boring truth. That they're a dwindling sect with no future in sight and no idea of how to run anything. And identifying these patterns of behavior is a huge part of waking up from indoctrination. Because if we don't identify them, we can fall victim to that same manipulation tactics even long after we stop believing in Jehovah. As an ex-Jehovah's Witness, I advocate for Jehovah's Witness to wake up, but I identify with my ex-Jehovah's Witness community. I feel very protective of our community, and I love our community of people waking up, learning critical thinking skills, and discovering who we were supposed to be all along. And nobody had warned about how Jehovah's Witnesses manipulate people into donating money until very recently. Just a couple months ago, a content creator in the XJW community started what I can only assume is a brilliant social experiment. He has spent almost a decade examining Watchtower, so he would be the best person to put together his own scheme to teach people the manipulative way that Watchtower treats their followers. At first, I didn't get it, and I was very upset that someone would fall as low as to use manipulation tactics to get money on people whom those tactics have already been proven. It started with a few tweets that could have come from Watchtower itself, asking for money while saying he wasn't asking for money. And surprisingly, that kinda worked. People somehow didn't see through it and started throwing money at him. I can only imagine the frustration he may have felt when he realized that his community hadn't learned this important lesson. So he ramped things up. He released a video where he uses every single manipulation tactic I've described in this video to ask for money. Starting by pretending making videos like the videos I make goes beyond making videos and is instead a life-saving work.
I would probably go down to like 2 or 3 videos per month, which I think would be something of a tragedy considering what we're doing now and the amount of content we're able to put out. The way I view it is every single video that we make has a potential to reach someone, because if we're just doing 2 or 3 videos per month, great. If that's all we can do, fine. But you never know what particular video is going to appeal to a particular person at a particular point in their lives. Only really with that team and with the support of patrons and now YouTube members and with the equipment we've been able to buy because of their support, are we able to produce not just the content that we're making, but the frequency of content, so that we're putting out a video at the moment sort of every day, sometimes 2 videos per day if you count the shorts. So
just like Watchtower, he over-exaggerates accomplishments, like when he pretends slicing long, barely scripted videos into smaller videos somehow counts as releasing regular content, and pretends that giving money to the mother of his children is somehow your responsibility and not his.
I have an amazing team working with me. I have Tibor, I have Diana working with me, and we're going to do what we can to continue with Tibor and with Diana.
Pay Tibor's wages, pay my wages, pay Diana's wages.
And just as I was starting to wonder if I could be wrong, he confirmed my reading by giving us the piece of resistance, apostasy.
Since we had all of the turmoil last year with the defamation campaign, the channel has struggled. The defamation campaign is still very much ongoing. My lawyers are still on top of it. It's just that the Croatian legal system, I've learned, is glacially slow, and it's probably going to be years before I see any kind of justice for what was done to me and my family. The defamation campaign was and is a failure.
That's right, the vague enemies that are spreading lies that you are not allowed to listen to are back. He even downplays what he did to pretend it's just about cheating on his wife regularly for years.
My mistake was to be unfaithful to my partner, and I'll always be sorry about that.
When, surprisingly, that's not why the vast majority of people stop supporting him. It's because of how he has continuously mistreated his wife. It's because he's been using sex work from places like Croatia, where there's a rampant human trafficking issue. And because after that, he went to the sex trafficking capital of the world, where exploitation is so widespread, it has its own very active Wikipedia article. The situation in Thailand is so bad. Virtually every anti-human trafficking organization has begged visitors to stop getting sex work there because it's impossible to determine whether a sex worker is a victim of exploitation, and the money will most likely go to human traffickers. And, well,
I think you've admitted to this that it wasn't just extramarital affairs, it was prostitution, is that right?
So well, I didn't want to have any relationships outside of my marriage. So yes, it was, and just to be absolutely clear, it was prostitution leading up to, before the conversation took place in December. So yeah, that it was with sex workers that I was unfaithful with my wife.
And that you had sort of a moral duty, I suppose, as the leader and the face of the Jehovah's Witnesses, to take care in that aspect, especially because, of course, many sex workers in, I believe it was Croatia and Thailand, will have been sex trafficked.
Well, I'm not a leader.
And aware with the sex workers that a lot of these would have been trafficked as children, and that is sort of goes against something that's very important to you, which is the protection of child sex trafficking and that kind of thing, right?
I've only ever had sex with consenting adults.
I don't mean to, I'm not intending otherwise.
I understand people's concerns about sex trafficking and that kind of thing, but ultimately the bottom line is, are we talking about sex between consenting adults, or are we not talking about sex between consenting adults?
Well, I suppose with prostitution, it's a blurry line with regards to consent and where that we don't know. That's the truth of it. You couldn't know a Thai prostitute.
Well, I dated a sex worker in Thailand.
Obviously, most of his patrons saw this and realized that they couldn't support this. And he brilliantly included this in his social experiment to become Watchtower, and asked for donations, pretending consequences for his potential sex crimes are somehow persecution.
It was a really cruel, sadistic way of attacking my reputation, and it had the predictable effect of drastically reducing the number of patrons who support my work, because they came to believe that I'm someone I'm not and that I'm somehow taking advantage of them.
And he finished strongly with this fellowshipping for asking questions.
Some of you will have noticed I pinned a comment saying that I would automatically and unashamedly delete all abusive, mean, toxic, victim-blaming comments along the lines of "get a job" or "it's all your fault anyway."
And it worked. Before I realized that this was a brilliant and obvious social experiment, and I thought this was for real, I spoke out against it because, you know, advocating for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses is kind of what I do. And I got the same kind of responses I would have gotten in the Jehovah's Witnesses. Things like, "Don't say negative things regardless of how true they are," or "but he's doing life-saving work," or "shouldn't we focus on keeping the peace?" Fully confusing criticism for insults. Many, instead of engaging with the argument, deciding to focus on whether me pointing something out was appropriate simply because it didn't portray another person in the most positive light. I was making Watchtower happy because they'd rather see us separated than working together against them. I got hit with every trick in the book to make me seem like I was betraying everything I stand for, all to keep anyone from asking a very simple question. Should I support this person? And that's the question that matters, because that's the question that requires critical thinking. You have to put aside your biases and re-examine yourself and your values to determine whether that's the right thing to do. Whether that's about your religion or about some content creator, that's always a hard thing to do. And I just gotta say, wow, he did it. We would have never had this conversation if he hadn't done this amazing social experiment, where he showed us that we're not done waking up just because we're out of a cult. Honestly, if it wasn't because I already saw through all of this, and because, you know, all of the potential abuse and sex crimes, I'd almost think about returning as his patron myself. So instead of ruining his game for everybody, I hid his face and name so you don't know who's the content creator who's doing this. That way, I won't rob anyone of the experience so artistfully crafted by this artist. However, I will give you the critical thinking questions you can respectfully ask him once you figure out who that person is. You can ask questions like, should someone who buys sex from the sex trafficking capital of the world advocate for victims of that same abuse? Or, who do you think should give money to the mother of your children, you or your followers? Or maybe even, who's Jake Vaughn and why did you delete his interview from your channel? All of these questions will kind of skip you ahead in the game if you are just playing it for the story and you just want to see how it ends. Or, even better, do nothing. We don't engage with the Watchtower religion directly because we know how delusional they are. And that's a lesson I've applied successfully to many other things outside the religion. Instead of engaging with him or donating your ice cream money to Watchtower, how about you give me money in exchange for the most apostate toy ever? This store has already been reopened, but don't worry, I won't be retiring my very important work from YouTube, pretending I'm the only person who makes this content if you don't buy a Sparlock. As I said before, this is mainly to mess with Watchtower, so you can now also buy the files to print your own little Sparlock. This is a long video, just don't fall for scams, okay?
Because there's no way I can do this volume of videos to this quality without Tibor and without the team that I have around me. So I guess I'm leaving it in your hands. I wish I had